I didn't even look at her when he said it. Edmund Harrow sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers laced together like a man deciding the weather, and told his 8 months pregnant wife that she would sign the papers, give up the child after birth, return to her family in disgrace, and never speak his name again in public. Not a question, not a discussion, a schedule. He had already consulted his lawyers. He had already spoken to her father. The only person nobody had consulted was Naomi. She picked up the brass inkwell from his desk and threw it at the wall. It left a stain that nobody ever fully cleaned out of the wallpaper. That was the moment. Not the day she found out about his other life. Not the morning she discovered the deed to her own inheritance had been quietly transferred into his name while she slept. It was that stain. That small, dark, irreversible mark that said, "Something happened here and it cannot be undone." 3 weeks later, Naomi Ashford stepped off a supply wagon in Iron Hollow, Montana, with $43, a construction handbook with a cracked spine, and a belly that made the wagon driver refuse to take her fare because he felt too guilty charging a woman who looked like she might give birth in his seat. She didn't want his pity. She took the coins back out of his hand and pressed them into his palm anyway. If you've ever felt like the whole world decided your story before you opened your mouth, stay with me. Because this one's about a woman who refused to let anyone else hold the pen. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if Naomi's courage moves you even a little, leave a like. It helps more than you know. Now, let's go back to Iron Hollow. The town of Iron Hollow in the summer of 1885 was not the kind of place that welcomed strangers warmly. It was the kind of place that watched you from behind curtain edges and decided what you were before your boots hit the mud. It had one general store, one saloon that doubled as a barbershop on Wednesdays, a church with a bell that had cracked sometime in the previous decade and never been replaced, and approximately 400 people who knew each other's business better than their own. Naomi knew none of this when she climbed down from that wagon. What she knew was that 40 acres on the eastern ridge, registered under her grandmother's maiden name and overlooked in Edmund's legal sweep of her assets, belonged to her. Her grandmother had purchased it decades ago as an investment that never materialized. The land had sat empty, untouched, legally uncontested, because nobody wanted it. The ridge was rocky, the soil was poor. A seasonal creek ran through the lower corner but dried to nothing by August. 3 different men in the county land office had attempted to buy it for almost nothing over the years and been ignored because Naomi's grandmother had died before selling it and nobody in the family remembered it existed. Nobody except Naomi, who had found the deed tucked inside a Bible in her grandmother's trunk 6 months into her pregnancy, on the night she finally understood that Edmund wasn't going to change. She had stood in the lamplight reading that deed for a long time. Then she'd folded it carefully, slipped it into the lining of her traveling coat, and started making a plan. The land office in Iron Hollow confirmed what she already knew. The acreage was hers, clean and clear. The clerk, a narrow-faced man named Pruitt, with ink permanently staining his right index finger, looked at her stomach, looked at the deed, looked at her face, and said, with genuine bewilderment rather than cruelty, "Ma'am, are you aware of what that land looks like?" "I'm aware," she said. "There's no structure, no cleared area. The ridge gets wind something fierce in the fall." "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." He stamped her paperwork with the look of a man watching someone walk into a river. She spent her first night in Iron Hollow at the boarding house run by a woman named Vera Stills, who was 62 years old, had buried 2 husbands, and had the kind of face that had long ago stopped pretending to feel things it didn't feel. Vera gave Naomi a room on the ground floor, so you don't have to climb stairs in your condition, and charged her a fair rate and asked no questions, which Naomi appreciated more than a warm meal. She did not sleep well. The baby moved all night, restless the way Naomi was restless, turning and pressing against her ribs like it was searching for more room. She lay on her back staring at the ceiling and made a list in her head. What she needed, what order she needed it in, what she absolutely could not afford to get wrong. Timber, foundation, walls before roof, roof before weather. She had read the construction handbook cover to cover twice during the wagon journey west, and once more the week before she left. She was not an engineer. She had never built anything larger than a garden trellis. But she had grown up watching her father's workers construct the additions to their estate, and she had that particular quality that some people are born with and cannot be taught. She paid attention. She paid attention to everything. The next morning, she walked her land for the first time. It took her 45 minutes to reach it from town on foot, which was a problem she cataloged and set aside. The land itself was, Pruitt hadn't lied, rough. Rocky outcroppings along the upper edge, scrub brush, dry grass, ground that had never been turned. But the lower quarter had something nobody had seemed to notice or care about. A natural windbreak formed by a long spine of boulders running east to west, and on the southern face of those boulders, a flat area roughly 30 feet square where the ground was actually soil rather than rock. She stood in that flat area for a long time. She pressed her boot heel into the earth. It gave. Not much, but it gave. "All right," she said out loud to nobody. Then she walked back to town and spent 4 of her $43 on a shovel. What followed, the next 8 days, became a kind of iron hollow legend that people recounted differently depending on who was telling it. The women at the dry goods store said they watched her walk past every single morning before dawn, carrying tools toward the ridge, her belly leading the way like a ship's prow, and they kept waiting for the morning she wouldn't come back. The men at the saloon made bets, $3 on her leaving before the end of the first week, $1 on some kind of medical emergency. One very drunk man bet a nickel that she'd actually build something, and he was laughed at until he bought his own drink in embarrassment. Naomi knew they were talking. She wasn't blind, and Iron Hollow wasn't subtle. What she didn't expect was Hattie Greer. Hattie was 9 years old, the daughter of the blacksmith, and she had the kind of relentless curiosity that exhausted adults and fascinated other children. On the third morning, she simply appeared at the edge of Naomi's worksite and stood there watching, arms crossed, head tilted. "You're doing it wrong," Hattie said. Naomi looked up from the trench she was digging. Her back had been aching since before sunrise, and her hands were already blistered through the work gloves she'd bought. "Is that right? The corner needs to go deeper, or it'll shift when the ground freezes. My daddy says that's why the Millerton barn fell down." Naomi looked at the corner. She looked at her handbook, open on a rock beside her. She looked back at Hattie. "How deep?" she asked. Hattie considered this with the gravity of a very small engineer. "Deeper than that." It was not the most technically useful advice Naomi had ever received, but Hattie came back the next morning and the morning after that, and on the 5th day she brought a bucket of cold water from the creek without being asked, and on the 6th day she brought her father's copy of a farming almanac that had a section on foundation depths in frost-prone soil. Naomi read it by lamplight that night and dug her corners deeper. She was not too proud to learn from a 9-year-old. That was something Edmund had never understood about her, that she wasn't proud, not in the way he was. She was stubborn, yes. She was immovable once she made a decision. But pride, the kind that would rather fail than accept help, had never been her particular affliction. The affliction she did have was one she recognized clearly. She pushed past pain she should have stopped for. By the end of the first week, her hands were not just blistered but cracked and bleeding under the gloves, and she had developed a deep ache in her lower back that spread into her hips by late afternoon every day. She sat down, drank water, pressed her hand against her side when the baby kicked particularly hard, and then stood back up. She did not stop. The lumber purchase nearly broke her. She had priced timber at the mill outside town and done the arithmetic 3 times, and no matter how she arranged the numbers, building any kind of proper cabin was going to cost more than she had. She sat with her handbook and her finances and made the first of many compromises. Not a cabin. Not yet. A single room, 12 feet by 14, with a loft she could frame roughly, but finish later. Minimal interior. Nothing unnecessary. Function over everything. She went back to the mill and ordered exactly what she could afford. The mill owner, a broad man named Carver, who smelled permanently of sawdust and tobacco, looked at her order and then looked at her and said, "You building this yourself?" "Yes." "You got a husband helping?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll deliver it to the base of the ridge. Can't get the wagon up past the rocks." "I know. Thank you. That's going to be a long haul up to your site." "I know." She carried lumber up that ridge by herself for 2 days before anyone offered to help, and the person who offered was not who anyone would have expected. She had heard of Silas Rowan the way you hear of a mountain before you see it, by its shadow. The Rowan Ranch was the largest operation in the county, and Silas was the older son, the quiet one, the one who showed up at town meetings and said almost nothing, and whose opinion, when he finally gave it, tended to end the discussion. He was 31 years old, unmarried, and regarded with the particular complicated respect that small communities reserve for people they can't quite figure out. She first saw him on the morning of the 9th day. She was hauling a 12-foot beam up the ridge path, both hands gripping it, leaning forward into the slope, breathing hard, when she became aware of someone standing at the bottom of the path watching her. She didn't stop. She got the beam to the flat and set it down and turned around. It was still standing there. "You going to say something useful?" she called down. "Or are you just watching?" There was a pause. Then he started up the path. He was taller than she'd expected from the way people described him. Not remarkable looking, solid through the shoulders, weathered from outdoor work, with a kind of stillness about him that she associated with people who had learned early that words cost more than silence. He reached the top of the path and looked at the site. The trench, the stacked lumber, the handbook weighted down by a rock, the water bucket, the tools arranged in the particular order she'd developed over the past week. He didn't say anything about the pregnancy, which she appreciated. "That beam on the left," he said finally. "It's got a bow in it. If you frame with it, the wall will pull." She looked at it. She hadn't caught that. "The mill sold me a bowed beam," she said. Not a question. "Carver's mill has been rushing their drying lately. It happens." He looked at the other stacked lumber. "You want me to check the rest?" She studied him for a moment. In her experience, men who offered to help without being asked either wanted something specific or thought they were rescuing you. She was not interested in being rescued. "What do you want for it?" she asked. He seemed genuinely surprised. "Nothing. People don't offer something for nothing. I'm looking at someone doing a hard job with bad materials," he said. "That's all." She let him check the lumber. He found 2 more pieces with problems. One with a hairline split she'd missed, one with a knot placement that would weaken a load-bearing position. He didn't make a speech about it. He just set them aside and told her which was which. Then he said, "I'll tell Carver to replace them." "I'll tell Carver myself," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Fair enough," he said. He left without drama, which was, she admitted to herself that night, lying in her boarding house room with the baby pressing against her ribs. Not what she'd expected. She had braced for the negotiation, the offer she'd have to refuse, the subtle pressure. There hadn't been any of that. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She went to Carver the next morning and got her replacement lumber, which Carver provided with the sheepish efficiency of a man who knew he'd been called out and wasn't prepared to argue about it. She hauled it up herself. And on the 11th day, Silas Rowan appeared again at the bottom of the ridge path. This time, he had a second pair of work gloves hanging from his belt. "I'm not here to run your site," he said before she could speak. "I'll do what you tell me to do, nothing more." She looked at him for a long moment. "The wall frames go up today," she said. "I need someone on the other end who doesn't drop things." "I don't drop things," he said. "We'll see," she said. They worked in near silence most of that day, which suited her fine. She directed, he followed. When he had a suggestion, and he had 2 or 3, quiet and practical, he said them once and didn't repeat himself if she chose not to take them. She took one of them and didn't take the others, and he didn't comment on either decision. By late afternoon, the first 2 wall frames were standing. She stood back and looked at them. Rough timber against the Montana sky, not beautiful, not perfect, but upright. And something in her chest went tight in a way that wasn't pain. "Same time tomorrow?" Silas asked. She looked at him. "I can't pay you." "I know." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the frames. Then he said, "My mother built the root cellar on our property herself, in her first year here. My father thought she was wasting her time." He paused. She wasn't. Naomi didn't ask what happened to his mother. Something in his tone told her it wasn't a story he gave away. "Same time tomorrow," she said. That night, sitting on the edge of her bed with her boots off and her feet swollen and her hands wrapped in cloth, Naomi allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of feeling how much everything hurt. Her back, her hands, the chronic grinding tiredness that had settled into her bones in a way that sleep only partly addressed. The baby had been quiet all evening, which she chose to take as a good sign. She thought about Edmund briefly. Not with grief. That particular season had passed before she packed her bag, but with something complicated that she didn't have a clean word for. He had looked at her and seen a woman who needed managing. He had been wrong about almost everything about her, and he had never once suspected it. That was perhaps the strangest part. Not that he was cruel, he was, in his way, though he'd have argued the point, but that he had genuinely not known her. After 3 years of marriage, he had not known her at all. She unwrapped her hands, looked at them in the lamplight, and wrapped them again more tightly. Tomorrow, the back wall went up. She blew out the lamp. Outside, Iron Hollow was doing what small towns do at night, settling into itself, measuring its opinions, preparing them for morning. By now, everyone knew about the woman on the ridge. Everyone had a theory about why she was doing it and how long she would last. The bets at the saloon had been revised upward. One man now held a position that she'd make it to a roofline before quitting, which was considered an optimistic view. Nobody had bet on her finishing. Nobody except Hattie Greer, who had put her entire savings of 31 cents on it, in a private transaction with herself that she recorded in the back of her school notebook and considered binding. Hattie was not often wrong about people, but Iron Hollow was about to make sure the odds got considerably harder. 3 days later, Naomi walked into the general store to buy nails and found 4 women standing near the counter who went silent in the particular way that means the conversation they'd been having was about you. She recognized 2 of them, wives of men she'd seen at the land office. The other 2 she didn't know. She got her nails, paid for them, and was almost to the door when one of the women, the taller one, with the set jaw and the quality dress that said money without shouting it, said, "You know people are talking." Naomi stopped. Naomi. She didn't turn around. People usually are. About you and Silas Rowan. Now she turned around. The woman's name, she would learn later, was Margaret Holloway, and she was connected to half the social architecture of Iron Hollow through her husband's dry goods business. She was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had learned to protect her own position through information management, which was a skill Naomi recognized because she had watched Edmund do it for 3 years. "We're building a wall frame," Naomi said. "Every morning," Margaret said, "alone on a ridge. I'm also building the wall. Would you like to come look at it?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "I'm saying this because someone should. You're in a visible position. People will talk, and what people say about a woman follows her, especially—" her eyes dropped, deliberately, to Naomi's stomach. "In your situation." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not hurt, exactly. More like something hardening. "I appreciate your concern," she said. The tone made clear she did not. "If people have questions about what I'm building and why, they're welcome to come ask me directly. My door will be open as soon as I have one." She walked out. Behind her, she heard the silence, and then the low beginning of conversation, and she kept walking because she already knew the shape of it, and she had timber to move and a roof to think about, and approximately 4 weeks left before her body stopped cooperating entirely. The walls went up slowly. Not as slowly as she'd feared. Silas was efficient, and he worked without complaint, and he had a quality she hadn't expected, which was genuine competence. He knew timber. He knew how things fit together, and he didn't explain things to her, which was its own kind of respect. He told her what he knew when she asked, and when she didn't ask, he did his work and let her do hers. But the talk kept getting worse. She heard it secondhand, through Hattie, who repeated things children hear because adults forget they have ears. She heard it from Vera Stills, who told her with the direct efficiency of a woman who respected her enough not to soften it. "They're saying Silas is keeping you," not in those words, but that's what they mean. "He's not keeping me," Naomi said. "I know that. You know that." Vera set down her teacup. "His father doesn't know that. And Calvin Rowan is not a man who accepts not knowing things about his own son." The name landed with a certain weight. Calvin Rowan's reputation preceded him like weather. Large, self-made, convinced of his own correctness and the particular way of men who had never been seriously wrong about anything that cost them much. He had built the Rowan Ranch from almost nothing, and he ran it with the absolute authority of a man who had confused his family with his property. Naomi filed the information and went back to work. 2 days later, she was on the ridge when she heard Silas below arguing with someone. She couldn't make out the words at first, just the tone, low and controlled on Silas's side, harder, and carrying on the other. Then the wind shifted and she caught fragments. Don't know anything about this woman. I know enough. Your name, Silas. This reflects on all of us. She kept working. She set a rafter notch and checked it twice and didn't look down the path. Silas came up alone about 20 minutes later. He had the particular careful composure of a man who had just had a significant conversation and was choosing not to show it. She didn't ask. He picked up his end of the next beam without saying anything. They worked for 2 hours in silence, and the silence was different than it usually was, heavier, with something in it that neither of them addressed. Finally, as they were setting the last piece of the afternoon, he said, "My father came to discuss my involvement here." "I heard some of it," she said. He looked at her. "What he said doesn't change anything for me." "It might," she said. "It might need to. I don't need the trouble for you, Silas. That's my trouble to decide about. It's also my sight," she said, "and my choice about what kind of complications I bring onto it." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking me to leave?" She looked at the roofline, partial, rough, the beginning of something. Looked at her hands. Looked back at him. "No," she said. "I'm saying I see clearly what this is costing you, and I'm not pretending otherwise." He nodded once, not with relief exactly, more with the recognition of being seen accurately. "Same time tomorrow," he said. She watched him go down the path. The baby kicked hard twice, in rapid succession, and she pressed her hand flat against her side and breathed. 23 days left, by her best estimate. The roof had to be finished before that. She picked up her tools and kept going. The roof wasn't finished when her water broke. She knew it was coming, had known for 2 days that something had shifted, that the baby had dropped lower and the pressure was different, and her body was sending signals she recognized from the midwife's manual she'd read 3 times at Vera's boarding house. She knew. And she kept working anyway because the roof had 4 sections and 2 of them weren't sealed, and the weather that had been threatening from the northwest for a week was finally making good on its promise. She was on the ground when it happened, not on the roof. That much she'd had the sense to arrange. She had been sealing the base of the eastern wall with the tar mixture Silas had helped her prepare the day before, crouched low and working fast, when the pain arrived with a seriousness that was entirely different from the practice contraction she'd been having for the past week. She sat back on her heels and breathed through it and looked at the sky. The clouds were moving in fast from the northwest. "All right," she said out loud, the same way she'd said it the first day she stood on this land. Not surrender. More like acknowledgement. She got herself to standing, which took longer than she would have liked, and she gathered her tools, not because the tools mattered in that moment, but because the habit of it steadied her, and she started down the ridge path. She made it halfway before Hattie Greer appeared, running up from the direction of town at a speed that suggested she had been watching for exactly this. "I saw you stop working," Hattie said, breathless. "I've been watching from the Tillman fence post every afternoon since last Tuesday." Naomi looked at her. "You've been standing on a fence post watching me work." "In case," Hattie said, with perfect 9-year-old logic. "I went and got Mrs. Vera already. She's coming with the doctor." Naomi sat down on a rock because her legs had decided to make the point for her. "You went and got Vera before you came up here." "I'm fast," Hattie said, "but I'm not that fast." Despite everything, the pain gathering in waves now, the unfinished roof, the incoming weather, Naomi laughed. It surprised her. It came out ragged and real, and she pressed her hand against her side and let it go. "Good thinking," she said. "I know," said Hattie, and sat down beside her on the rock to wait. The birth happened inside the cabin. Not in a hospital, not in the boarding house, not in any of the places the town had quietly assumed she would retreat to when the moment came. In the cabin she had built, on a cot that Silas had carried up the ridge 2 weeks earlier without being asked. He'd simply appeared one morning with it loaded on his horse and said, "The ground gets cold," and left it, with Vera Stills and the town doctor, a tired man named Hale, who had delivered approximately 400 babies in his career, and approached this one with the same practical competence he brought to all of them. It was hard. That needs to be said plainly, because the story of what came after tends to flatten what it actually cost. Naomi Ashford was 31 years old, had been doing physical labor for nearly 4 weeks on insufficient food and sleep, and her body was at the end of what it reasonably had left to give. The labor lasted 11 hours. There were points in the middle of it where she stopped being able to keep the larger picture in her head and there was only the immediate, the next breath, the next wave, Vera's hand on her wrist, Dr. Hale's voice giving her information instead of reassurance because she had told him at the start, very clearly, "Don't comfort me, just tell me what's happening." He had respected that. At just past 2 in the morning, with rain finally arriving against the roof in the particular drumming sound that Naomi would ever after associate with this moment, her daughter was born. She was small, red-faced and furious about the whole situation, which Naomi took as a sign of good character. Dr. Hale said she was healthy. Naomi held her and felt something she didn't have a name for. Not the soft golden feeling she'd half expected, but something rawer. More like the feeling of finishing a very long, hard thing and finding it was real. "She needs a name," Vera said. "Clara," Naomi said. She had decided this weeks ago, lying in the boarding house while the baby moved. Her grandmother's name. The woman who had bought 40 forgotten acres and left them to collect dust until her granddaughter needed them. Clara Ashford, named for a woman who had thought ahead without knowing it. The rain kept on through the night. The roof held. Not perfectly. There was a seep along the eastern join that Naomi had known about and not yet fixed, and by morning there was a wet patch on the floor about the size of a dinner plate. But the main structure was sound. The walls were sound. The cot was dry. The baby was warm. Naomi looked at that wet patch on the floor and mentally added it to the list. She was back outside in 6 days. Not full work. She wasn't reckless, or rather, she was reckless in specific ways, but not that way. She walked the exterior, checked the eastern join, assessed what needed sealing before the next rain. She held Clara in one arm while she did it, which was not ideal technique but was the available option, since Hattie had school in the mornings, and Vera could only spare a few hours in the afternoons. It was on the third of these assessments that she heard horses on the lower path and looked up to see a man she hadn't met yet but recognized immediately. Calvin Rowan was not a large man in the physical sense. He was Silas's height, maybe an inch shorter, with the kind of compact, centered solidity that comes from decades of actual physical work rather than the performing of it. He was perhaps 60, gray at the temples, with a face that had been weathered past the point of reading easily. He rode with the particular ease of someone who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He stopped his horse at the base of the ridge and looked up. Naomi looked down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Calvin Rowan dismounted, tied his horse to a scrub branch with practiced efficiency, and came up the path. He walked the way his son walked, deliberate, without wasted motion. When he reached, he looked at the cabin the way Silas had looked at it the first time, assessing rather than dismissing. Clara was asleep against Naomi's shoulder. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Mr. Rowan," she said. He looked at the cabin again, at the walls, the roof line, the foundation trench visible at the corners. He looked at the eastern join she'd been assessing. He looked at the tools arranged on a flat rock nearby, where she'd set them to free her hands. "My son tells me you directed this build yourself," he said. "Your son helped with the framing," she said. "I directed it." He was quiet for a moment. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned that from Silas, maybe, or maybe she'd always known it. "I came here to ask you something," Calvin said. "I'd prefer to ask it directly." "Go ahead. What is your intention toward my son?" She looked at him steadily. "I intend to pay him for his labor when I have the means to do so. Beyond that, my intentions don't concern you." Something moved across his face. Not anger. She'd expected anger. Something more complicated. "He turned down a contract in Billings," Calvin said. "A significant one. Because he wanted to stay through your situation. He made that decision himself." "I know he did." A pause. "That's what concerns me." Naomi shifted Clara slightly. The baby made a small sound but didn't wake. "Mr. Rowan, with respect, I have not asked your son for anything he didn't offer. I have not encouraged him toward anything that would compromise his position with you or this community. If he makes choices about his own time and his own priorities, those are his choices. I'm not responsible for them." "You're not responsible for the effect you have on people?" It landed like a challenge. She met it directly. "I'm responsible for my own actions, not for how other people respond to them." Calvin Rowan looked at her for a long time. She had the feeling of being measured, the way the mill owner had measured her lumber order, not with hostility, but with a particular precision. That cabin will need the east seam sealed before the next rain, he said finally. She looked at him. I can see the water stain from here, he said. The pitch of the joint is off by a degree or two. Water finds that every time. I know, she said. It's on my list. Your list, he repeated. I keep a list. Something happened in his expression that she couldn't fully name, somewhere between grudging and something else. He put his hat back on, which he'd removed when he reached her level without seeming to notice he'd done it. My son is not easily moved, he said. It wasn't a complaint. It was almost like information he was offering her. I know, she said. He went back down the path without another word. She watched him go, then looked at the eastern seam, then at Clara sleeping against her shoulder. That's his father, she told Clara. Clara had no opinion. The seam got fixed 2 days later. Silas did it while she held the baby and told him where the problem was, which was an arrangement she was aware looked a certain way to anyone watching, and she had made her peace with that. What she hadn't made her peace with was Margaret Holloway. The social pressure in Iron Hollow had not decreased with the birth of Clara. If anything, it had sharpened, because now there was a child involved, and the people of Iron Hollow had opinions about children in cabins on ridges, with mothers who were, as Margaret had taken to phrasing it in the hearing of various women at the dry goods counter, very independent in a tone that made independence sound like a disease. Naomi heard about it the way she heard about most things, through Hattie, who heard everything, and through Vera, who told her plainly. Margaret has been talking to the wives of the county commissioners, Vera said one afternoon, over the tea she sometimes brought up the ridge when she came to help with Clara. About the child's welfare, the living conditions. Naomi went still. She's suggesting the cabin isn't safe. She's suggesting several things. The lack of a husband, the isolation, the... Vera paused, chose her words with unusual care. She mentioned Edmund Harrow. The name in this context was a different kind of cold. She knows about Edmund. People talk, Naomi. Letters travel. Iron Hollow isn't as cut off as it feels. Vera set down her cup. Someone in your old county wrote to someone here. I don't know who, but Margaret knows you left a marriage. I didn't leave a marriage, Naomi said. I left a man who had already decided the marriage was over and was simply allocating the remains. I understand that. But she left her husband is easier to say at a dry goods counter. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Clara was in the cot, asleep. The afternoon light came through the one window Naomi had installed, crooked by a quarter-inch, which bothered her every time she looked at it, and fell in a stripe across the floor. What does she want? Naomi asked. Margaret, what does she actually want? Vera considered this honestly. I think she wants the world to stay in the shape she understands. You're a problem she doesn't have a category for. That's her problem. Until it becomes yours. Vera looked at her steadily. She has access to people who make decisions in this county. If she decides to make your life more difficult officially, not just socially, she has the means to try. Naomi absorbed this. She had known it was possible. She had known from the moment she stepped off that wagon that this kind of town contained this kind of pressure, and that it would find her eventually. She had hoped to be further along, more established, more financially stable before it arrived. She was not further along. She had a sealed cabin, an eastern seam that now held 40 acres of uncleared land, $6 left, a 3-week-old daughter, and hands that still hadn't fully healed. All right, she said, for the third time, in that same tone. Not surrender. Acknowledgement. The thing she did next surprised even Vera. She went to see Margaret Holloway. Not to confront her, not to argue. She put Clara in the carrier she'd made from 2 lengths of cloth, walked to the Holloway house on the main street, knocked on the front door, and when Margaret answered, visibly startled, the composure arriving a half-second late, Naomi said, I'd like to talk, if you have time. Margaret had her into the parlor with the practiced hospitality of a woman who couldn't refuse without appearing to refuse. Tea arrived. The kind of tea that came in china cups that announced something about who you were. They sat across from each other. Clara slept in the carrier. Naomi set her hand lightly on the baby's back. I know what's being said, Naomi began. I'm not here to argue about it. I'm here because I think you're a practical woman, and I'd rather talk to you directly than hear about it secondhand. Margaret's expression was carefully composed. I've only expressed concern for the child. I know. Naomi kept her voice level. Then let me tell you about the child. Clara has a roof, a solid one. I can show you the construction if you'd like. She has walls that don't shift. She has a mother who gets up before dawn and works, and hasn't asked this town for a single thing it wasn't willing to give freely. She paused. What she doesn't have is a father present, and I suspect that's the real concern. Margaret didn't say anything. I am not going to acquire a father for my daughter in order to satisfy this town, Naomi said. That is not going to happen. If that makes her life harder here, and I understand it might, then I will deal with that when I need to deal with it. But I will not be pressured into a decision about my own family, because it makes other people more comfortable. The silence went on for longer than was comfortable. Then Margaret said, very quietly, My own marriage was not my choice. Naomi looked at her. I'm not saying that to... I don't know why I'm saying it. Margaret looked at her teacup. I married the man my father chose. He's not unkind, but it was not my choice. A pause. I have had choices since then that were mine, and I have protected them, sometimes aggressively. Naomi studied her. And I'm a threat to the choices you've made. You're a question I don't know how to answer, Margaret said. There's a difference. It was not a friendship. It was not reconciliation. But something shifted in that parlor over bad tea and good china, and when Naomi left, the specific campaign to contact the county commissioners had quietly stalled. Not stopped. Margaret Holloway didn't stop things cleanly, but stalled. Naomi walked home up the ridge with Clara still sleeping against her chest, and didn't tell anyone about the visit except Vera, who listened to the whole account and then said, You took a risk. I take risks, Naomi said. This one worked. This one worked, Naomi agreed. But she knew, and she thought Vera knew too, and probably Silas knew when she told him later, watching his face, that it had only worked in a particular direction. The social pressure had eased. The official pressure hadn't been applied yet. And Edmund Harrow's name was in this town now, floating in the talk the way things float in water, catching light in ways she couldn't predict. She had about 3 months before winter made serious demands on her resources. She needed to clear a section of the lower acreage, break the ground, and get something planted, even a late-season crop, even a partial one, to reduce what she'd need to purchase through the cold months. She needed to repair the loft, which was still rough-framed and not properly sealed. She needed to build a storage area on the north face of the cabin. She needed money, which meant she needed to either sell something or work for someone else, and working for someone else meant leaving Clara. She sat with all of this the way she sat with most problems, laid out in sequence, assessed for priority, addressed in order. Silas, when she explained it, didn't offer money. She would have refused it, and he knew that. What he said was, The Rowan Ranch needs a ledger clerk for the winter accounts. My father's man left in September. It's desk work, 3 mornings a week. My father would pay fairly. She looked at him. Your father? I mentioned it to him. He didn't say no. Did he say yes? He said he'd seen your materials list and your construction notes, and that you had organized thinking. That was, she recognized, a significant thing for Calvin Rowan to say. She wasn't sure it was a job offer exactly, but she wasn't sure it wasn't. 3 mornings a week, she said. Vera said she'd watch Clara those mornings. You talked to Vera? I mentioned it to her, yes. She looked at him for a moment. This man who didn't ask permission to help, who simply arranged things and presented them and left the decision entirely to her. Who had not, in all the weeks she'd known him, made a single move that felt like ownership. You're very careful, she said, about how you help. He thought about this. My mother didn't like to be rescued, he said. She liked to be helped. There's a difference. What happened to her? The question came out before she decided to ask it. A pause. Fever. When I was 17. He said it in the way of someone who has said it many times and the words have become smooth with use, but the thing underneath hasn't. She'd been planning to expand the east pasture herself. She had drawings. A beat. My father finished it, exactly the way she'd drawn it. Naomi was quiet. He's not a soft man, Silas said, but he's not what he looks like from a distance either. She took the accounting work. 3 mornings a week, she rode to the Rowan Ranch. Silas had lent her a horse, an old steady mare named Bucket, who moved at exactly 1 speed regardless of encouragement. and sat at a desk in the ranch office and organized 4 months of chaotic accounts with the systematic precision of someone who had managed a large household's finances for 3 years and never been given credit for it. Calvin Rowan, on her first day, walked into the office, looked at what she'd already done in the first hour, and said, She had learned that for Calvin Rowan, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. By her third week, he was leaving notes on the desk for her. Questions about discrepancies he'd noticed. Not asking her to fix them, asking her what she thought. She answered in writing, precisely, with the logic laid out. He left more notes. It became a conversation conducted entirely on paper, which suited both of them. The money was real. Not large, but real. And it meant she could buy seed for the lower field and the materials she needed for the storage addition and still have something left for the deepest part of winter. Clara grew. 3 weeks, 4, 5. She had Naomi's eyes, which were gray and tended toward skeptical, and she had a voice she was not shy about using, and she held her own head up earlier than Dr. Hale said was typical, and he said it like it surprised him, and Naomi said, "It doesn't surprise me," and he laughed. Life on the ridge had a shape now. Not comfortable. Comfortable wasn't the right word, and maybe it wasn't the goal, but it had structure. Morning work, accounting work 3 times a week, afternoon work, evenings with Clara, lists by lamplight. Silas came up 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with a specific task, sometimes with materials she hadn't asked for but had needed, always leaving before it got dark, always with that same quality of presence that wasn't pressure. She wasn't in love with him. She knew what love felt like, or what she'd thought it felt like once, before 3 years with Edmund had taught her to question her own reading of things. She wasn't sure she trusted her own judgment about it anymore. What she knew was that Silas made things easier without making her smaller, and she wasn't ready to name more than that. She was almost ready to think about it when the letter arrived. Vera brought it up herself, which told Naomi something before she even looked at the envelope. Vera was not a woman who made unnecessary trips. The letter was from a law office in her former county. 3 pages, formal and cold, using the language that legal documents use to make ordinary cruelty sound procedural. Edmund Harrow had become aware of the birth of a female child. Edmund Harrow was asserting his paternal rights. Edmund Harrow's attorneys were requesting a preliminary meeting to discuss suitable arrangements for the child's welfare and the restoration of appropriate domestic order. That phrase, restoration of appropriate domestic order. She read it 3 times. Clara was on the floor on a blanket, awake and working very hard at the project of getting her fist into her mouth. She was not successful yet, but she was committed. Naomi set the letter down on the table. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with a kind of distant interest. "He knows where I am," she said. "Yes," Vera said. He waited until after she was born to file. He waited until he could make a parental claim. She thought about this. He planned it. That's what it looks like. Naomi looked at Clara, who had given up on the fist project and was now looking at the ceiling with the focused attention of someone who has discovered something very interesting up there. "He can't take her," Naomi said. Not a question, a statement she was testing out loud. "The law is not. There are provisions. A mother in residence, established home. I have the deed. I have documentation of every board and beam." "You need a lawyer," Vera said. "I can't afford a lawyer." "You'll need to find a way." A pause. "Or find someone who knows the law." Naomi picked up the letter again. Read the firm's name. Read the county of origin. Read Edmund's name in the formal styling, the way documents used his name like it meant something, like it settled things. Edmund Harrow. The man who had handed her a schedule for the dismantling of her own life and expected her to follow it. She thought about what she'd said to Margaret Holloway in that parlor. "I will not be pressured into a decision about my own family because it makes other people more comfortable." That had been about social pressure, small stakes, really, in comparison to this. This was different. She set the letter down. She looked at the cabin around her, the walls she had raised board by board, the roof that had held through 2 rains now, the floor she'd laid herself on hands and knees while her back screamed at her, the eastern seam that was sealed and solid. Every part of this space was documented. She had kept records out of habit, materials lists, construction notes, the handbook with her own marginalia in every margin. She had not kept them for a legal purpose. She had kept them because she was a person who kept records. But they would serve. "I'll need to file a response," she said, "and I'll need to find someone who knows the law. And I'm going to need to know exactly what this county's statutes say about paternal claims when a mother has established independent residence and legal land ownership." Vera looked at her steadily. "You've already started thinking about the argument." "I started thinking about it on the second read," Naomi said. Vera almost smiled. "I'll ask Dr. Hale. He knows people." Naomi nodded. She was already making the list. Outside, the October wind had come down from the mountains in the early way it sometimes did, carrying in it the first real promise of winter. The cabin didn't shudder. The walls didn't shift. The roof made its familiar sound, the particular low sound of solid timber under wind, not a groan of weakness, but something more like an exhale. It had been built to last. And so had she. Dr. Hale knew a man named Garrett Oakes, which was either fortunate or the best they were going to get. And in Iron Hollow in October, those two things were often the same. Oakes had practiced law in 3 counties over 20 years and was currently practicing in the 4th, which was this one, out of an office above the saddle repair shop that smelled permanently of leather and linseed oil. He was 54, had a drinker's nose but clear eyes, and when Naomi laid Edmund's letter on his desk, he read it with the particular stillness of someone who had seen this shape before and recognized it without needing to be impressed by it. "He waited for the birth," Oakes said. "I know. That's deliberate. A paternal claim on an unborn child is harder to file, easier to look unreasonable. After the birth, there's a person, a legal subject." He turned the page. "His attorneys are from the Harrow firm in Millbrook County?" "His family's firm. His father founded it." Oakes looked up at her. "You married into a legal family." "I married a man whose family happened to practice law. I didn't know at the time what that meant as a practical matter." "And now you do." He set the letter down. "Mrs. Ashford, I'll tell you plainly what you're facing. Harrow can argue abandonment of the marital home. He can argue you took the child, before she was born, technically, but his lawyers will frame it as intent, into unsuitable conditions. A ridge cabin in Montana built by a woman alone, no established income, no male head of household. In 1885, those arguments carry weight with certain judges." "What certain judges?" "The ones his family's connections reach." A pause. "He'll have filed in your home county. That's where the case will be heard if he has his way. His ground, his people, his courthouse." She had known this was likely. Knowing it didn't make it land any softer. "Can I challenge the venue?" Oakes tilted his head. "On what grounds?" "The child was born here. I have established legal residence here. The land is registered here. This county has jurisdiction over property disputes affecting the child's welfare." He looked at her for a moment. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had 3 days." "That argument has merit," he said slowly, like a man weighing something real. "It's not guaranteed, but it has merit. If we can get the hearing moved here, or at minimum establish this county as the primary jurisdiction, you're on better ground." "I need you to file that motion," she said, "and I need to know the cost." He named a figure. It was more than she had, less than she'd feared, which meant it was in the range of the possible if she thought carefully. "I can pay half now," she said. "The rest when the accounting work at the Rowan Ranch pays its next cycle." He considered this. "You're working for Calvin Rowan?" "His accounts. 3 mornings a week." Something shifted in Oakes's expression. Not quite respect, more like a recalibration. "All right," he said. "Half now, half on account. I'll file the venue motion this week." She paid him from the envelope in her coat pocket, counted it out precisely, and stood up to leave. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. She turned. "The venue motion buys us time, but time is what Harrow's lawyers are best at. If this goes to a full hearing, you'll need to make a case that is airtight. Not just adequate, airtight." "I know," she said. "What evidence do you have?" She looked at him steadily. "Everything I've built." She went back up the ridge that afternoon and stood outside the cabin in the cold October light and looked at it the way Garrett Oakes might need to describe it, or the way a judge might need to picture it. She tried to see it fresh, not through the lens of every hour she'd spent building it, every decision, every compromise. Just as a structure. It was small. 12 by 14 on the main floor with the loft above. The walls were straight. She had checked them with a level borrowed from the mill, twice. because she'd known even then that everything needed to be documented. The foundation sat correctly in its trench. The roof had held through 3 rains and 1 early ice. The floor was laid tight with no significant gaps. The eastern seam, sealed twice now, was solid. It was not beautiful. She had never cared about that. But it was sound. Every decision she'd made had been sound, and she had the records to prove it. Materials lists with dates, cost notations, the construction handbook with her own notes in the margins marking where she'd deviated from the text and why. Silas's name appeared in her records twice, framing assistance, 3 days, because she had written down everything, every one, every contribution, because that was who she was and it happened to now be exactly what she needed. She went inside and got Clara and held her against her shoulder and stood in the doorway, looking out at the ridge falling away toward town. Edmund had planned this. She needed to keep that in its proper position in her thinking, not let it become something that frightened her, but keep it as information. He had planned it, which meant he had thought about it, which meant somewhere in his thinking was a version of this situation where he won. She needed to understand that version clearly enough to dismantle it. His version, a woman who had abandoned her home and her position, living in unsuitable wilderness conditions, with no stable income, no husband, no male protection, no community standing, a child in genuine risk, a father willing to provide what the mother clearly could not. She went through it piece by piece, abandoned her home. She had left a marriage that had already been effectively dissolved by her husband's actions. She had the deed to her land. She had legal residence. Abandoned was the wrong word, and she could argue it was the wrong word. Unsuitable conditions, a structurally sound cabin with documented construction on legally owned land in a settled county with medical access. Dr. Hale had seen Clara twice since the birth. She had those records. She would get copies. No stable income, the Rowan accounting work. 3 mornings a week, documented, paid. Not large, but consistent, and growing. Calvin had mentioned in one of his written notes the possibility of expanding her work to the spring accounts as well. No community standing. This was the one that was genuinely complicated because the social landscape of Iron Hollow was mixed. Some people had come around. Hattie's father, the blacksmith, had started nodding to her with something like respect. Dr. Hale spoke well of her. Vera Stills would say whatever needed to be said under oath, and Vera's word carried weight in this county. But Margaret Holloway's camp was still cool, still watchful, and some of the commissioners' wives were in that camp. She needed witnesses. Real ones. People who would stand in a courtroom if it came to that, and say what they'd seen. She thought about who would do it. Vera, yes. Dr. Hale, likely. Hattie's father, possibly. And Silas. Silas was the complicated one. His testimony would be powerful. The heir to the Rowan Ranch, a man the county knew and respected, saying clearly what he'd seen. But his testimony would also invite exactly the narrative Edmund's lawyers would want to build. The vulnerable woman and the rancher's son. The suggestion of dependence, of something being provided that shouldn't need to be. She needed to think carefully about how Silas fit into this. She was still thinking about it when he arrived the next morning with new lumber for the storage addition and the news that his father wanted to talk to her. About the legal situation? She asked. He didn't say. He doesn't usually announce what he wants to talk about ahead of time. Silas set down the lumber with the particular ease of someone who made things look physically simple because they'd done them 10,000 times. He asked if you could come to the ranch Thursday morning. I'm scheduled to do accounts Thursday morning. He knows. He said before the accounts. She looked at Silas. He was giving her information, not pressure, which was his consistent way. But she understood what it meant that Calvin Rowan was requesting this conversation specifically and in person rather than in the written notes they'd been exchanging. He had something to say that he wanted to say directly. All right, she said, Thursday before the accounts. Calvin was in the yard when she arrived Thursday, not in the house. He was checking the fence line along the near paddock, moving with the methodical efficiency of a man who used physical work the way other men used conversation. He acknowledged her arrival with a nod and kept moving along the fence for another minute before he stopped and turned. Oaks filed your venue motion, he said. It wasn't a question. Monday, she said. I know Oaks. He's competent enough. A pause. I know the judge in your home county, the one Harrow's lawyers will have in mind. She kept her expression steady. And? And he's not corrupt, but he is traditional. And traditional in that county means what it's always meant. Calvin looked at the fence, then back at her. If Harrow gets his hearing there, you'll need more than a sound cabin and good records. What will I need? He was quiet for a moment, and the way that she'd learned meant he was being precise rather than reluctant. You'll need this county to speak for you, formally. People whose word carries weight at a distance. Another pause. I can write a letter about your work here, your conduct, the land. I've had 3 other ranchers mention your name in the past 2 months in connection with the building project. Not all of them positively, but they mentioned it, which means they noticed. A letter from you would matter, she said. A letter from me would matter to the right people, yes. He looked at her with the same direct assessment she'd experienced the day he came up the ridge. I want to be clear about what I'm offering and what I'm not. I'm not inserting myself into your legal situation. I'm not doing it for Silas, or not only for him. I watched what you built. I watched you run accounts that 3 men before you left a mess, and you straightened in 3 weeks. I have an opinion about competence, and I'm willing to put it in writing. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had come up her ridge in the early weeks wanting to know her intentions toward his son, and had since been conducting a parallel assessment of her on entirely different grounds. Thank you, she said. Not elaborate. He wasn't a man who needed elaboration. Don't thank me yet, he said. A letter is one thing. If this goes to a full hearing and they bring it here, which your motion is trying to achieve, you'll need to stand up in front of people and make the argument yourself. Your lawyer can speak the legal language, but the argument about who you are and what you've made here, that's yours to make. I know that. Some people freeze, he said. In a formal setting, under pressure, with someone on the other side actively trying to take something from them. They know their case perfectly well, and they freeze. She looked at him steadily. I threw a brass inkwell at my husband's wall when I was 8 months pregnant. I don't think freezing is my particular problem. A pause. Something crossed Calvin Rowan's face that she had never seen there before. It was quick, and it was genuine, and it was very close to amusement. No, he said. I don't suppose it is. The venue motion was answered 3 weeks later with a counterfiling from Edmund's lawyers that was, Oakes told her, aggressive in its language and specific in its targeting. They had done research. They had her marriage records, the property transfer documents from when Edmund had reorganized their financial arrangements, which, Oakes noted, would actually work in her favor if handled correctly, since it documented Edmund's consolidation of her assets without her meaningful consent. They had a statement from Edmund himself that characterized her departure as erratic and emotionally unstable. She read that word, unstable. She set the document down. She picked it up again. He's going to argue she's not mentally fit to parent, she said. He's going to imply it, Oakes said. Carefully. Legally, you can't simply declare someone unstable without evidence, and he doesn't have evidence. What he has is the story of a pregnant woman who walked away from a comfortable home to go build a cabin alone in Montana, and depending on who's telling it, that either sounds like courage or it sounds like something has gone wrong with her thinking. And which way will it sound to the judge? That depends on whether we get a hearing here or there. He tapped the counterfiling. They've cited 3 precedents for keeping jurisdiction in the originating county. I have 2 responses. It's going to be close. She went home and sat with Clara in the cabin and was honest with herself about what close meant. Close meant it might not go the way she needed. Close meant she had to be prepared for the alternative, which was traveling to her former county with Oakes and making her case on Edmund's ground, in front of a judge who would have received her husband's version of events first. She was not afraid. That was true, and she'd examined it carefully enough to trust it. She was something different from afraid. A focused, cold attention that had the feeling of being ready in a way that wasn't comfortable but was real. She wrote down, that night, by lamplight, everything she wanted to say if she got the chance to say it. Not prepared remarks, she wasn't going to read from a paper in a courtroom, but the shape of it, the architecture, what she had done and why and what it meant. She wrote it out and crossed things out and wrote it again and crossed more out, and by the end she had half a page of words that were true and specific and hers. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her coat. The hearing date arrived on a gray Tuesday in late November, and in the end, because Oakes had been more than competent enough, because the venue argument held on 2 of the 3 points, because the judge in their county was a man named Farrow, who was traditional in some ways and surprisingly precise in others. The hearing was held in Iron Hollow. Edmund arrived the day before. She didn't see him come in, but Iron Hollow was Iron Hollow, and Vera told her within 2 hours of his arrival that he had taken the best room at the hotel, that he had 2 lawyers with him, plus a man who appeared to be a personal secretary, and that he had walked the main street in the afternoon looking at things with the expression of a man who had already decided what he thought of them. "He asked about you at the hotel," Vera said, "about your circumstances." "What did they tell him?" "That you had a cabin on the East Ridge, and a daughter, and that you did accounts for Calvin Rowan." Vera paused. "He asked if you were under the protection of the Rowan family." His words. Naomi absorbed this. "He's going to use Silas. His lawyers will try." "Silas knows it's coming?" "Silas," Vera said, with the tone of someone reporting a fact about weather, "came into town this morning and told Oakes he'd testify to whatever Oakes needed and that his father had already sent the letter and was prepared to appear in person if required." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "Calvin Rowan will appear in person," she said. "That's what Silas said." She thought about that. Calvin Rowan, who ran the largest ranch in the county, whose word closed discussions, showing up in a courtroom to speak for a woman who threw inkwells and carried lumber up ridges and kept meticulous records of everything. The man who had come to her ridge expecting to find a problem and found instead something that demanded a different response from him. She would not have predicted this outcome 2 months ago. She would not have let herself. She saw Edmund for the first time that evening. She hadn't intended to. She had been in Oakes's office going through the order of proceedings when she walked out into the early dark, and he was on the street. He was with one of his lawyers, 20 feet away, both of them walking toward the hotel. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He looked, she searched for the word, smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was the same height, the same broad-shouldered man she'd married. But something about the context made him smaller. He was on her ground now, in the town she had arrived in alone, carrying a deed and $43 and a cracked handbook. He was the stranger here. He stopped. His lawyer kept walking for a half step and then stopped too. Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then his eyes went to Clara, who was bundled against Naomi's chest in the cloth carrier, mostly hidden by Naomi's coat. Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it cleanly, and she didn't spend much time trying. "Naomi," he said. "Edmund," she said. There was nothing else to say on a street in the dark with lawyers present. She kept walking. She felt his eyes on her back for about 10 steps, and then she turned a corner, and they weren't. Her hands were not shaking. She checked. They were not. The courtroom the next morning was the county meeting hall reconfigured with additional chairs, which was the closest Iron Hollow had to a formal legal space. Judge Farrow was a lean man of 60 who had the habit of looking at witnesses the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to trust. The gallery held perhaps 40 people, more than Naomi had expected. She recognized faces: Vera, Dr. Hale, Hattie's father, the blacksmith; Margaret Holloway, in the 3rd row, with her husband; Calvin Rowan in the back, standing, because he'd arrived late and all the seats were taken and hadn't asked anyone to move. Edmund's lawyers were from the city, which meant they were polished and moved with the particular ease of men who treated courtrooms like professional environments rather than foreign territory. The lead attorney, a man named Colbrath, had silver at his temples and the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. Naomi sat beside Oakes and looked at her hands on the table in front of her. Clara was with Vera, in a back room off the main hall that Vera had arranged with the meeting hall's caretaker, close enough that Naomi could hear her if she cried. Colbrath opened with the version of events Edmund had prepared: a wife who had abandoned the marital home in a state of emotional disturbance, taking an unborn child into conditions manifestly inappropriate for an infant, making decisions that indicated poor judgment, and placing herself in a position of financial and social dependency on a local ranching family whose interests were not necessarily aligned with the child's welfare. He didn't mention Silas by name in the opening. He said, "a member of the local ranching family," with a particular emphasis that let the room fill in what it wanted to fill in. Naomi watched the judge's face while Colbrath spoke. Farrow wrote things down. He didn't react visibly. That was either a good sign or a bad one, and she couldn't tell which. Oakes's opening was shorter and more specific. He referred to exhibits, the deed, the construction records, the accounting employment documentation, the doctor's records on Clara. He said, "Your Honor, the question in this proceeding is not whether Mrs. Ashford's choices would have been everyone's choices. The question is whether a woman of sound mind, with documented resources, legal property ownership, established income, and a healthy child in her care, has the right to raise her daughter in the home she built with her own hands. We intend to show that she does, and that she has, and that any claim to the contrary is not a concern for the child's welfare, but an attempt to reclaim control over a woman who declined to remain controlled." The room was quiet for a moment after that. Farrow wrote something down. Edmund's lawyers called 3 witnesses. A man from Naomi's former county who testified to what he characterized as her erratic departure. A doctor from that county who had treated her once for mild exhaustion during her pregnancy before she left, and who, under careful questioning from Colbrath, allowed that emotional instability might be consistent with the behavior described. A woman who had been a neighbor of the Harrow household who testified that Naomi had always seemed like a difficult person, which was so vague that Oakes didn't bother objecting, just wrote a note on his pad. Then Oakes called Dr. Hale, who testified in the precise and undramatic language of a man who treated illness for a living and had no investment in saying anything other than what was true. Clara Ashford was healthy. She was developing appropriately. Her mother had made sound decisions during and after the birth. The cabin, which he had visited twice, was structurally adequate and clean. He had no concerns about the child's welfare. Colbrath cross-examined him about the primitive conditions of the cabin. Hale said with the same undramatic precision, "I have attended births in this county in conditions considerably worse. The cabin in question is solid, weatherproof, and warm. If that is primitive, then most of the residences in this county are primitive." A small sound ran through the gallery. Not laughter exactly. Recognition. Then Oakes called Silas. Colbrath was on his feet immediately, anticipating the opportunity, and he made his move in the cross-examination rather than the direct testimony, letting Silas describe what he'd seen and done, the framing, the lumber assessment, the roof work, before asking, with the careful precision of a man who had prepared this question specifically, "Mr. Rowan, would you characterize your relationship with Mrs. Ashford as that of an employer and employee?" "No," Silas said. "A friend?" "Yes." "A close friend?" "A friend," Silas said. Same word, same weight, without elaboration or defensiveness. "You visited her property nearly every day for several weeks." "I helped with construction, yes." "And after the birth of the child?" "I continued to help when help was useful." "You lent her a horse?" "Yes." "Provided materials?" "Some materials, yes." Colbrath paused for effect. "Mr. Rowan, isn't it accurate that Mrs. Ashford's establishment of this homestead has been substantially dependent on your support, financial, physical, and social?" Silas looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "No." "No?" "Mrs. Ashford built that cabin. I helped carry some timber and check some lumber quality. The decisions, the plans, the work, those were hers. When I made suggestions, she decided whether to take them. Twice she didn't take mine, and she was right both times." A brief pause. "She doesn't need my support to have built what she built. What she built is evidence of itself." Colbrath regrouped. It cost him something, that redirect. The jury, there was no jury, only Farrow, but the room was the jury in the way that mattered, had heard it. Then Calvin Rowan took the stand. He did not look like a man performing. He looked like a man who had something to say, and had chosen to say it here because this was where it needed to be said. He confirmed his letter. He confirmed Naomi's employment. He said, when asked to characterize her competence, "I've had 4 account clerks in 8 years. She's the first one I haven't had to correct." Then Oakes asked him, "Mr. Rowan, based on your observation of Mrs. Ashford over these months, her conduct, her work, her home, her care of her child, do you have any concern for that child's welfare in her mother's care?" Calvin Rowan looked at the judge, not the room. "None," he said. "Zero concern." Colbrath's cross-examination of Calvin lasted 6 minutes and accomplished nothing because Calvin Rowan answered questions the way he did everything, with minimal words and maximum precision, and there was nothing to find purchase on. Then Oakes said, Your Honor, we'd like to call Mrs. Ashford. She had known this was coming. She had prepared it. She touched the folded paper in her coat pocket, not to read from it, just to remind herself it was there, that she had done the work of knowing what she wanted to say. She sat down in the chair at the front of the room and looked at Judge Farrow and waited. Oakes asked her to describe, in her own words, the events leading from her departure from her marital home to her arrival in Iron Hollow. She did. She was specific. She mentioned the deed, her grandmother, the $43, the handbook. She mentioned the land office and the boarding house. She did not editorialize about Edmund. She described what happened without characterizing it, because she understood that a woman who seemed angry was easier to dismiss than a woman who stated facts. Oakes asked her to describe the construction. She described it. She had the records in a folder on the table, 37 pages of notes, materials lists, dates. And she referred to specific pages as she spoke, dates and costs and decisions, the foundation depth and why, the roof pitch and why, the seam problem and how she'd solved it. She spoke for 11 minutes about the process of building a cabin, and in those 11 minutes the room learned more about timber construction than most of them had known before, and more about who Naomi Ashford was than Edmund's lawyers had prepared for. Then Colbrath stood up. He began with the stability argument. He asked about her state of mind when she left. She answered directly. He asked about the extreme nature of the decision. She said, "Building a legal home on land I own is not extreme. It's practical." He asked about her financial situation. She cited the Rowan employment, the land value, the documented costs and remaining resources. He pushed on the dependency angle. She said, "Two people helping carry lumber does not constitute dependency. It constitutes community, which is what people do." He asked about Edmund's claim to the child. She looked at him and said with a clarity that was not anger, but was close enough to it to carry the same charge, "Edmund Harrow knew I was pregnant. He called me into his office and told me, in advance of any discussion, without asking me a single question, to give up the child after birth, return to my family, and never speak his name. He had already spoken to my father. He had already consulted his lawyers. The one person he did not consult was me." A pause. He had 7 months after that to write a letter, to arrive at a door, to express a single concern for that child's welfare. He did not. He waited until she was born and established a claim. That is not a father concerned about his daughter. That is a man who cannot tolerate having lost an argument. The room was very quiet. Farrow had stopped writing. Colbrath said, "Mrs. Ashford, isn't it possible that Mr. Harrow is genuinely concerned for his daughter's well-being and simply, anything is possible," she said. "But I was married to this man for 3 years. I know the difference between his concern for things and his concern for control of things. Clara is not a thing." She said it evenly, not loudly. She wasn't performing for the gallery. She was talking to Farrow, whose pen had moved again, and she watched him write something and looked at the folded paper in her coat pocket one more time, and then looked straight ahead. Colbrath sat down. Oakes had no redirect. Farrow called a recess. She walked out of the courtroom into the cold air of the hallway and went to the back room where Vera had Clara, and she picked up her daughter and held her and didn't say anything for a long time, and Vera didn't ask her to. Through the wall, she could hear the low movement of the gallery, the sound of 40 people in a small room doing what 40 people in a small room do, talking quietly about what they'd just seen, deciding what it meant, revising the opinions they'd had that morning. Clara put her fist in her mouth. Successfully, this time. Naomi pressed her face against the top of her daughter's head and waited. Farrow took 2 days. That was longer than Oakes had expected, and he told her so without softening it, sitting across from her in his office the morning after the hearing, while the November wind worked at the window frame with the persistence of something that had all winter and knew it. 2 days means he's writing carefully, Oakes said, which means either he's constructing a ruling in your favor that he wants to be airtight, or he's constructing one against you that he wants to be defensible. He looked at his coffee cup. "There's no clean way to read it." "I know," she said. "How are you holding up?" She thought about giving him the easy answer. Then she thought about the fact that he was her lawyer, and accuracy probably served her better than composure. "I'm tired," she said. "I slept 4 hours last night. Clara has a tooth coming in, and she was unhappy about it from about midnight until 5 in the morning. I'm tired, and I'm not sure what I do if it goes the wrong way, and I haven't been able to think that far without the thinking going sideways." Oakes nodded. He didn't offer reassurance, which she had come to appreciate about him. If it goes the wrong way, we appeal. The record is strong. Pharaoh's written ruling, whatever it says, creates a document we can work with. Appeal takes money. Yes. And time. Yes. A pause. But you've built time before. You know how to do that. She went back up the ridge. She did not sit and wait because sitting and waiting was not something she was constructed for. She worked on the storage addition, which was half-framed and needed the sidewall set before the ground froze any harder. Silas came at mid-morning and worked beside her without asking about the hearing or the ruling or anything except whether the corner post was at the right angle, which it was, and whether she wanted the shelf supports at 2 feet or 30 inches, which she thought about and said 30 inches. They worked for 3 hours. The wall went up. At one point, without looking at her, Silas said, "Whatever Pharaoh decides, it's not the end of the road. I want you to know that I know that, in case you need someone to know it alongside you." She kept working. "I know it. I know you know it. I'm saying I know it too." She looked at him then. He was checking the level on the corner post, not looking at her, which was typical of him. He said the thing and then gave her space to do what she wanted with it. No expectation of response, no pressure toward a particular reaction. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to checking the level. That was all. It was enough. The second day passed the same way. Work in the morning, accounts at the Rowan Ranch in the afternoon, Clara in the evening, lamplight, and the list and the tooth. That was still troubling her daughter and making the nights long. Calvin had left a note on the desk about a discrepancy in the September feed costs that she unraveled in about 20 minutes, wrote her explanation in the margin, and left it for him. He came into the office while she was finishing and read it over her shoulder without asking permission, which was his way, and said, which was his version of thank you, and poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and poured a second cup, which he set near her elbow without comment. She looked at the cup for a moment. "How's the tooth?" he asked. "Still coming in." "First one's the worst." He sat down across the desk. "My wife said the same thing about both boys. Said it was worse watching than having it yourself." A pause. She had not heard him mention his wife directly before, only through Silas, obliquely, in the way of someone referred to in the past tense. She was usually right about things like that. "She sounds like she was," Naomi said. He looked at the window. "The ruling will come tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question. "Oakes thinks so." "Pharaoh is deliberate, but he's not slow. 2 days is him being careful, not uncertain." He paused. "I've seen him rule in hard cases before. He doesn't enjoy being wrong." "Is that reassuring?" Calvin considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "It means he'll rule on the evidence rather than on comfort. That's better than the alternative." He picked up his coffee. "Your evidence was good." She looked at him. "You think so?" "I watched you in that courtroom. You didn't perform. That matters to Pharaoh." A brief pause. Colbrath performed. Pharaoh has been watching lawyers perform for 30 years. He knows the difference between a man making an argument and a man making a case. She absorbed this. Coming from Calvin Rowan, who spent words the way some men spent money, reluctantly, and only when the return was worth it, this was more than she'd expected. "Your testimony helped," she said. "My testimony was accurate," he said, which was how he received it. She finished her coffee and rode Bucket back down the road toward the ridge, and the horse moved at her one unvarying speed through the early dark, and Naomi sat in the saddle and let herself, for the first time in 2 days, think fully about what it would mean if Pharaoh ruled against her. She had the appeal. She had Oakes. She had this county's record now, documented and witnessed, and an appeal would carry it to a higher court where Edmund's family connections in his home county would matter less. She could survive an adverse ruling. She had survived things that were supposed to break her before this. But Clara, that was the part that didn't bend to reasoning the same way. Clara in her cot in the cabin, with the tooth coming in and her fist that she could now reliably get into her mouth, and her gray, skeptical eyes that were already, at 3 months, looking at the world as though she were taking notes. If an adverse ruling meant Edmund's lawyers could apply for interim custody while the appeal worked through the system, which Oakes had told her was possible, not likely but possible, then she was looking at a window of time where her daughter could be removed and placed, and she would have no recourse except the legal machinery that moved at its own pace, regardless of what it cost the people inside it. She would not let that happen. She didn't know precisely what that meant in terms of action, but she knew it as a fact the way she knew the roof pitch and the foundation depth and the eastern seam, measured, certain, hers. She got home. She fed Clara. She walked the exterior of the cabin by lamplight, the way she sometimes did when she needed to think, pressing her hand against the walls at the corners, feeling the timber under her palm. Everything she'd said to Colbrath in that courtroom was true. Every word. She went inside and slept 5 hours, and it was the best sleep she'd had since before the hearing. The ruling came the following afternoon, delivered by a county clerk to Oakes's office, and Oakes sent Hattie, who had apparently appointed herself the town's primary messenger in cases of significance, up the ridge to get Naomi at 2 in the afternoon. Hattie arrived at a run, which told Naomi something before the child opened her mouth. "Mr. Oakes says, 'Come now,'" Hattie said, slightly out of breath. "He says, 'Bring your coat because you'll want to walk home in the cold after.'" Naomi looked at her. "That's what he said." "He was smiling when he said it. He doesn't usually smile." She put her coat on. The ruling was 19 pages. Oakes had already read it twice by the time she arrived, and he handed her the summary page first, which was the professional courtesy of a man who understood that some people needed the answer before the explanation. She read the summary page. Edmund Harrow's petition for custody was denied. The claim of maternal unfitness was rejected on the grounds of insufficient evidence. The claim that the child's living conditions constituted a welfare risk was rejected in specific terms, Farrow had written, in language that was more pointed than legal opinions typically were, that a structurally sound, legally owned residence with documented construction and a medically attended healthy child did not constitute unsuitable conditions under any applicable standard, and that applying such a standard selectively to women who built their own homes would create a precedent this court was unwilling to establish. Naomi Ashford's legal ownership of the land and residence was confirmed. Clara Ashford's primary residence with her mother was confirmed. Edmund Harrow was ordered to bear the court costs of the proceeding. She read it twice. Then she set it down on Oakes's desk. "He ordered Edmund to pay costs," she said. "He did," Oakes said. That's a statement." "It is." Oakes was doing the thing she'd seen him do twice before when something went correctly. A controlled exhaling, like a man releasing pressure he'd been holding for days. "Farrow doesn't assign costs lightly. He's saying this proceeding should not have been brought. That's on the record." She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She hadn't planned to. Her legs made the decision. "It's over," she said, not quite believing it as she said it. "This phase is over," Oakes said carefully. "Harrow can appeal. He has 30 days. "Will he?" Oakes considered this honestly. "His lawyers will advise him against it. The record is worse for him on appeal than it was here. Farrow's opinion is very specifically argued, and challenging it means re-arguing the same facts in front of a higher court that will have read what Farrow wrote. The costs argument alone signals that this was not a close case." A pause. "My read is that he won't. But Edmund Harrow is a man accustomed to decisions going his way, and men like that don't always take good legal advice when it conflicts with their sense of themselves." "I know," she said. She sat for another minute. Then she stood up, shook Oakes's hand. He looked slightly surprised, which she noted, and walked out into the cold. She had not cried during the hearing. She had not cried during the 2 days of waiting. She did not cry now. What she felt was something that didn't have a clean word. Not relief exactly, because relief implied that fear had been the primary state, and she had been operating in something more like cold forward motion than fear. More like the feeling of setting down a beam that had been exactly as heavy as she'd expected, and carrying it had cost exactly what she'd known it would cost. She was tired. She had been right to be tired. She could be tired now without it meaning anything except that she had done a hard thing and it was done. She walked through town and several people caught her eye, but Vera, coming out of the boarding house, who read her expression and nodded once with the composure of someone who had expected this and was profoundly glad to have been right. The blacksmith, Hattie's father, who was standing outside his shop and said, without preamble, "Heard it went right." She said yes. He said good, and went back inside. She stopped at the dry goods store because she needed nails for the storage edition, and standing in line for nails was approximately the most normal thing she could think of to do, and normal felt like exactly the right register for this moment. She was standing at the counter when Margaret Holloway came in. They looked at each other. Margaret had clearly already heard. Her expression had the quality of someone who had processed news and arrived at a position about it. "Congratulations," Margaret said. It was formal. It was real. Naomi looked at her for a moment. "Thank you." "The ruling was correct," Margaret said, which was, Naomi suspected, the most significant admission Margaret Holloway had made in some time. To say the ruling was correct meant the claim had been wrong, meant Edmund had been wrong, meant the women who'd gossiped at dry goods counters about the independent woman on the ridge had been, in the particular way that social pressure is always wrong when it's deployed against someone who simply refuses to collapse under it, wrong. "I appreciate you saying so," Naomi said. And she meant it. She got her nails and went home. The letter from Edmund arrived 11 days later. Not from his lawyers. From him directly, which was unexpected enough that she held the envelope for a full minute before opening it. His handwriting was the same as she remembered, controlled, angular, the handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship and considered it a reflection of character. The letter was 4 paragraphs. She read it standing at the table with Clara in her arm. He did not apologize. She had not expected him to. Apology was not a mode Edmund operated in. What he did in 4 careful paragraphs was something more surprising. He acknowledged that his assessment of her capabilities had been incorrect. Not in those exact words. He was too careful for directness of that specific kind. He said that the proceeding had made clear that she had established herself more thoroughly than he had understood. He said that he did not intend to pursue the appeal. He said that he hoped, and this was the sentence she read 3 times, that Clara would be raised to know her own mind. He did not say he had been wrong, but he said Clara should know her own mind, and in Edmund Harrow's vocabulary, that was the closest thing to an admission she was ever likely to receive. She folded the letter and put it in the same tin box where she kept the deed and the court ruling and Clara's birth record. Then she went back to work. Silas came up the ridge that afternoon and could tell immediately that something had shifted. He read her the way he read timber, looking for the structural truth rather than the surface. He didn't ask what. He helped her finish the storage wall, and when they were done, standing in the cold looking at it, he said, "Letter from Harrow?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "That I'd established myself more thoroughly than he understood, and that Clara should know her own mind." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's as close as that man comes to an apology." "I know. How do you feel about it?" She thought about this honestly. "I feel like it doesn't change anything that matters, and it confirms some things I already knew. And I feel like I'm ready to stop thinking about Edmund Harrow and think about the Southfield instead." Silas looked at her. Then he said, "The Southfield needs the rocks cleared before you can turn it. That's a full week of work." "I know. I'll help." "I know you will," she said. There was a quality in that exchange that neither of them addressed directly. Not that day. There was something between them that had been building for months with the same deliberate patience that she'd used to build her walls, and they both knew it was there, and neither of them was in a hurry to name it before it was ready to be named. She was not in a position to rush that any more than she could have rushed the foundation curing. Some things had to set. Calvin Rowan's response to the ruling came in characteristically. Calvin fashion. He said nothing about it directly, but expanded her accounting contract to 4 mornings a week, beginning the following month, with a corresponding increase in pay. She found the new terms on the desk when she arrived on Monday, written out in his deliberate hand, with a single note at the bottom that said, "Spring accounts will be more complex. You'll want the additional time." She read it twice, thought about the woman he'd described, his wife, who had built the root cellar herself and had drawings for the east pasture, and understood that this was Calvin Rowan saying, in the vocabulary available to him, that he saw her clearly and considered her worth the investment. She wrote back in the margin, "Agreed. I'll begin the spring ledger restructuring in February." He left a note the next day that said simply, "Good," and she found herself alone in the ranch office with the winter light coming through the window, almost smiling at a single word on a piece of paper. December came in with its full weight. The first serious snow arrived mid-month and reordered everything. The rhythms of work shifted to what the cold allowed, which was less outside and more inside. She finished the loft properly, put real boards on the floor rather than the rough framing she'd been living with, added the second shelf to the storage area. She worked on the spring planting plan at the table by lamplight while Clara slept, drawing out the south field in sections, calculating what she could realistically clear and turn and plant, by what dates, what crops made sense for the soil composition she'd assessed in the fall. She had tested the soil herself. Her construction handbook had a brief section on soil assessment that she'd followed and then supplemented with information she'd gotten from a farming almanac and from a conversation with the miller's wife, who had been farming this county's soil for 30 years and knew it the way Naomi was beginning to know her timber. The lower south field was better than she'd initially assessed. The soil composition was workable, and if she got the rocks cleared before the real freeze set in and turned it properly in early spring, she could have a viable crop in the ground by April. She was not thinking about this as a dream. She was thinking about it as a plan. There was a difference. Hattie came up the ridge twice a week now, ostensibly to help with Clara, but really because she had assigned herself a role in this household that no one had offered and no one had refused. She was 9 years old going on 40, and she had decided that Naomi was worth paying attention to, and Hattie's attention, once fixed, was not easily redirected. She had told her father she was learning things on the ridge. He had asked what things. She had said, how to figure out what's wrong and fix it without asking anyone to do it for you. Her father had thought about this and said that sounded useful. In January, Hattie arrived one Tuesday with a notebook she'd been writing in and asked Naomi if she would look at it. Naomi looked at it. It was a list, organized in Hattie's cramped 9-year-old script, of all the problems Hattie had observed on the ridge property and possible solutions for each of them, organized by priority and estimated difficulty. Some of them were wrong. Some of them were surprisingly right. Naomi sat down at the table and went through the list with her, point by point, explaining where the thinking was correct and where it had missed something and why. It took an hour. Hattie listened with the total attention of a person who took information seriously and didn't require it to be simplified. At the end, Hattie said, "The number 4 one is wrong, isn't it? The drainage idea? Yes. The water doesn't run that direction. I thought it did. Easy mistake. The ridge tilts a degree west of where it looks like it tilts. Come out in a rain sometime and watch where the water actually goes." Hattie wrote something in her notebook. "Okay." Naomi looked at her. "Where did you get the idea to make this list?" Hattie looked at her with the expression of someone who considered this a strange question. "From you," she said. "You make lists for everything." Naomi looked at the notebook, at the cramped, serious handwriting, at the organization of it, problems, solutions, priority, difficulty. Not perfect, but structured, thought through. She handed it back. "Keep doing this," she said. Hattie took the notebook and put it back in her coat pocket with the care of someone putting away something worth keeping. The winter had its hard weeks. There were 3 in January when the temperature dropped to something that made leaving the cabin a negotiation with real risk. And she was grateful then, specifically and practically grateful, in the way she was grateful for the sealed eastern seam, for the thickness of her walls, for the insulation she'd packed between the inner and outer layers of the north face, for decisions she'd made in August that she hadn't known she was making for January. The cabin was cold but not dangerous. The difference mattered. Vera came up twice in February with food that went beyond what Naomi had asked for and was presented without any framing that would require Naomi to refuse it. Vera understood her well enough by now to know exactly how to help without triggering the part of Naomi that found help complicated. She set the food on the table and asked about Clara's tooth and left. And Naomi cooked the food and fed her daughter and was simply grateful without having to perform anything about it. In February, Silas told her that his father had mentioned her name in a conversation with 3 other ranchers in the county, in the context of the spring land clearing, and that Calvin had characterized her Southfield project as sound planning for difficult soil, which had led to a discussion of soil management that ended with 2 of the ranchers expressing interest in her plans. She looked at Silas. "He told other ranchers about my planting plan. He passed on the methodology. He didn't attribute it at first. Then one of them asked where the approach came from, and he said your name." "What did they say?" Silas thought about this. "One of them said the woman who built the cabin. Like that was your name now. The other one asked if you'd be willing to talk through the approach." She absorbed this. The woman who built the cabin. As identifications went, she had been called worse things. She had been called unstable in a legal document. She had been called difficult by a neighbor who didn't know her. She had been called a problem nobody had a category for. The woman who built the cabin was, in the register of Iron Hollow, in the register of this ridge, in the register of a winter she'd come through intact, accurate. "Tell them I'd talk," she said. "Thursday afternoons, I'm usually working the Southfield prep by then, but I can stop early." Silas nodded. "And tell your father—" She stopped. "What?" She thought about how to say it, this thing she'd been thinking about for a few weeks, turning it over the way she turned problems. "Tell him that the East Pasture drainage design your mother made, whatever drawings she had, if there's anything in them that applies to my Southfield drainage, I'd be grateful to see them, if he's willing." Silas went very still. "He still has them," he said. Not a question. He knew his father. "I figured he might." A long pause. "I'll ask him," Silas said. She didn't know what Calvin Rowan would do with that request. She didn't know if she'd overstepped, if she'd misread something, if there was a version of this where she'd touched something she shouldn't have. She'd thought about it and decided it was worth the risk. Not because she needed the drawings, but because the offer of needing them was the most honest thing she knew how to give a man who had spent years keeping his wife's work intact without anyone asking him why. She went back to her Southfield planning. The list was on the table. The field was waiting. The ground would thaw when it thawed and not before, and she would be ready when it did. That was the shape of things now. Not resolved in the soft golden sense. There were still weeds in the field and rocks to move and accounts to square and a daughter cutting teeth and a something with Silas that didn't have a name yet and a town that was still making up its mind about her in some quarters. It was not finished. Life wasn't finished. It was ongoing, which was the only version of it worth having. 3 days later, a note arrived from Calvin Rowan. Not on the account desk paper. Different paper, older, with slightly different handwriting. More careful, like something written slowly. It said, "The drawings are in the ranch office, top right drawer. You may look at them when you come Thursday." She read it twice. Then she put it in the tin box, with the deed and the ruling and Clara's birth record and Edmund's letter, and she closed the lid and she went back to work. The drawings were in a leather folder, tied with a cord that had been knotted and unknotted enough times that the leather around it had worn soft. Naomi untied it carefully, not because she was told to be careful, but because the folder had the quality of something that had been handled with intention for a long time, and she respected that without needing to think about it. There were 6 pages inside. Pencil drawings, precise and detailed in a way that surprised her. Not the rough sketches of someone thinking out loud, but measured diagrams with notations in a small, neat hand. Drainage channels marked with depth indicators. Soil composition notes in the margins. A second page showing the grade of the land in cross-section, with water flow indicated by arrows that had been drawn and redrawn in places, the earlier lines visible as ghost marks beneath the final ones. She sat at the ranch office desk and looked at them for a long time. The woman who made these had understood her land the way Naomi was learning to understand hers, not as property, but as a system, something with its own logic that you had to learn before you could work with it. The East Pasture drawing showed 3 years of thinking. You could see it in the revisions, in the way the early ideas had been corrected and refined and corrected again. Nothing had come easy. Nothing had arrived finished. She heard Calvin come into the office behind her. She didn't look up immediately. "She revised the main channel 3 times, Naomi said. 4, Calvin said. He poured himself coffee and sat down in the chair across the desk, which was not his usual position. Usually he stood or leaned against the doorframe. Sitting across from her at his own desk was a different arrangement, and they both knew it. The third version worked on paper, but the ground didn't match her grade estimates. She had to resurvey the north slope. Did she do the survey herself? She did everything herself when she could. A pause. She said it was the only way to trust the data. Naomi looked up at him. "I say the same thing." "I know," Calvin said. They sat with that for a moment. The drainage principle she used on the East Pasture, the angled intercept channels, would work on my Southfield, Naomi said. The grade is different, but the problem is the same. Water pools at the lower corner in the spring thaw and doesn't move. If I cut intercept channels here and here, she pointed at her own rough field sketch, which she'd brought in her coat pocket. The water moves before it saturates the seedbed. Calvin leaned forward and looked at her sketch, then at his wife's drawing, then back. He pointed at a spot on Naomi's sketch. You'd want to account for the rock shelf at that point. It'll redirect the channel if you don't cut around it. Is the rock shelf visible? It's about 8 inches down. You'll hit it when you dig. She made a note. He watched her make it without saying anything. Thank you, she said. For these. She meant the drawings. He picked up his coffee. She would have told you the same things herself, he said. It came out quieter than his usual register. She liked people who worked carefully. Naomi folded her sketch and put it back in her pocket. She retied the leather folder with the same careful knot and set it on the desk between them. Do you want these back? Leave them in the drawer, he said. You may need to refer to them again. She went back to the accounts then, and he went back to whatever Calvin Rowan went back to, and neither of them said anything more about the folder or the woman who made it. But something had shifted between them in that conversation that was permanent in the way some things are permanent. Not loud, not marked, but there. She drove Bucket home in the late afternoon and thought about it, and thought that some of the most significant moments in her life had been quiet ones. The moment she found the deed in her grandmother's Bible. The moment she pressed her boot heel into the south face soil and it gave. The moment Silas said, I don't drop things, which had been the beginning of something she still hadn't fully named. She was ready to name it now. The Southfield rock clearing began in late February when the ground thawed enough to get tools into it, and it was exactly as hard as she'd calculated and slightly harder than she'd hoped, which was about typical. She and Silas worked it together most mornings, levering rocks out with iron bars, moving them to the field's edge, where they'd eventually become a serviceable boundary wall if she stacked them right, which she intended to. Nothing wasted. Every problem that solved itself becoming the solution to another problem down the line, that was the logic she'd developed on this land, and it was sound logic. Silas worked rocks the way he worked timber, steadily, without drama, without complaint, without needing to be the one who decided where each one went. She decided. He moved them. When he had a thought about it, he said it once and dropped it, and she took it or didn't based on what she could see. On the third morning of clearing, with February giving way grudgingly to the first suggestions of March, she said, while they were both leaning on iron bars waiting for a particularly large rock to decide to move, I've been thinking about something. All right, he said. About us. She kept her eyes on the rock. About what this is and what it might be and whether I'm ready to have that conversation. He was quiet for a moment. The rock shifted, just slightly. Are you? He asked. Not pressuring, actually asking. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. I don't have a clean answer. I know that I trust you. I know that I have not trusted many people in my adult life, and I trust you specifically, and not in the way I trust Vera or Dr. Hale. Different. I know that when you're not here, I notice it in a way that's become informative. She paused. I also know that I spent 3 years in a situation where I disappeared inside someone else's idea of what I should be, and I'm not... Another pause. I'm not afraid of you, but I'm careful about the difference between a thing that looks safe and a thing that is safe. The rock moved. They leveraged it clear of the ground and rolled it to the edge line. Silas straightened and looked at her. I know the difference between helping you and owning you, he said. I've known it since the first day I came up this ridge and you asked what I wanted for checking your lumber. That question, that was who you are. I'm not interested in a different version of you. She looked at him. I'm not in a hurry, he said. I'm not going anywhere. I'd like to be part of what you're building here, and I mean that in every sense of the word, and I'll wait for you to be ready if you're not ready now. She looked at the field around them, the cleared section, the rock line building at the edge, the turned soil at the far corner where she'd started breaking ground, the cabin visible on the rise above them, solid against the March sky. I'm not going to be a different woman because of what's between us, she said. I won't be. That's not a warning. It's just true. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. She picked up her iron bar. Help me with the next one, she said. He picked up his. They worked the rest of the morning in the particular silence that had characterized them from the beginning. Companionable, productive, neither of them needing it to be more than what it was. But it was more than what it had been, and they both knew it, and that was enough to begin with. The south field was turned and ready by the third week of March. She had cut the intercept drainage channels following the principle in the elder, Mrs. Rowan's drawings, accounting for the rock shelf that Calvin had mentioned. And when the late March rains came and the spring thaw ran hard off the ridge, she stood at the field's edge in her coat and watched the water move the way it was supposed to move, down the channels, around the rock shelf, off the lower corner into the drainage she'd dug. And it worked. Not perfectly. There was one spot midfield where the grade was slightly off, and water pooled briefly before finding the channel, and she made a note to correct it before the next rain. But it worked. The seedbed stayed workable. The soil didn't saturate. She planted in early April. Potatoes primarily, because potatoes were forgiving of imperfect soil and could be stored and would keep her and Clara fed through another winter without depending on what she could afford to buy. Turnips in the south corner where the drainage was best. A kitchen garden along the cabin's east wall. Vegetables she needed rather than wanted, practical choices made by a woman who had stopped pretending that wanting things was the same as needing them. Hattie was there for the planting, which had become simply a fact about Hattie. She was there for things that mattered, showing up with her notebook and her questions and her bottomless capacity for paying attention. She had turned 10 in March, and her father had brought her a new notebook to replace the one she'd filled, and the new one had begun the way the old one ended, with lists, with observations, with the particular structured thinking that Naomi had watched develop in her over these months, like something growing in good soil. "If the potato yield is what you estimated," Hattie said, crouched at the edge of the first row, "you'll have enough to sell some in the fall." "That's the plan," Naomi said. "To who?" "Vera takes produce for the boarding house table. The Tillman family buys root vegetables. There are 2 or 3 other households that buy local rather than from the supply wagon because the supply wagon charges too much." She tamped soil around a seed potato. "And Calvin mentioned that the ranch kitchen goes through more potatoes in a winter than they grow themselves." Hattie wrote something in her notebook. "What are you writing?" Naomi asked. "Your customer list," Hattie said. Naomi looked at her. "I don't have a customer list." "You do now," Hattie said. She stared at the 10-year-old crouched in her field making a customer list without being asked, and felt something that was approximately fond exasperation and approximately pride and not entirely separable. "You're going to be formidable," Naomi told her. Hattie looked up. "What does formidable mean?" "It means people will have to take you seriously whether they want to or not." Hattie considered this. "Good," she said, and went back to writing. The 2 ranchers who had expressed interest in Naomi's planting approach came out in April to look at the south field, both of them arriving on a Thursday afternoon as arranged, both of them with the particular manner of men who had not expected to take a woman's farming methodology seriously, and were now in the process of revising that position in real time while trying not to appear to be doing so. She walked them through the drainage channels, the soil preparation, the planting decisions, the logic behind each choice. She was specific. She used the correct terminology. She did not explain anything twice. One of them, a man named Greer, who was not related to Hattie, asked how she'd learned the intercept drainage method. "From a set of drawings," she said, "made by someone who had solved the same problem on different land." "Whose drawings?" She thought about the leather folder in the ranch office drawer, about the small, neat handwriting and the ghost marks of earlier attempts visible beneath the final lines. "Someone who worked carefully," she said. Greer nodded like that was a sufficient answer, which said something about what he'd seen in the field that afternoon. The second man, whose name was Alcott, looked at the cabin on the rise and said, not meanly, just with genuine curiosity, "You built that yourself." "With some help on the framing," she said. "How long did it take?" "From breaking ground to sealed roof, 26 days. He looked at it for another moment. He said, which she recognized by now as the sound that men in this county made when something exceeded what they'd anticipated and they weren't ready to say so directly. She had cataloged this sound over months. Calvin made it. Greer made it standing in her field. Even Oakes had made a version of it when she'd outlined her legal argument on their first meeting. It was the sound of a recalibration happening inside someone who hadn't asked for it and wasn't sure how to accommodate it yet. She had stopped finding it satisfying and started finding it simply factual. This was who she was. The recalibration was their business. Spring moved into early summer. The potatoes came up. The turnips came up. The kitchen garden along the east wall produced more than she'd estimated because the wall itself, which faced south, held warmth in the evenings and extended the growing hours in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. A happy accident that she documented and would account for next season. Clara, now 7 months old, had 2 teeth in a crawl that she'd developed with the same committed intensity she'd brought to the FIST project, and she moved through the cabin with the absolute confidence of someone who had not yet learned to doubt herself, pulling herself up on table legs and chair rungs and looking at the world from the new height with an expression that Naomi recognized as her own. "Know your own mind," Edmund had written. She intended to make sure of it. Vera came up the ridge on a June evening and sat on the bench Silas had built along the south wall of the cabin. Not asked for, just appeared one morning while Naomi was in the field, and watched Clara move through the grass at the cabin's edge, and said, "You look different than when you got here." "I'm not 8 months pregnant," Naomi said. "That's not what I mean." Vera watched Clara examine something in the grass with the total focus of a baby who has found something interesting. "You look like someone who knows where they are." Naomi thought about this. "I didn't when I got here." "No, you knew where you were going. That's different." She thought about the distinction. Vera was right. Those were different things. She had known where she was going on the day she stepped off the wagon, to the land, to the cabin she was going to build, to the life she was going to make. Knowing where you are is something else. It comes later. It comes from having been somewhere long enough that the ground feels like yours, not because you claim it, but because you know its specific weight under your feet at different times of year, the way it behaves in the freeze and the thaw, where it will hold and where it won't. She knew this ridge now. She knew this cabin. She knew the eastern seam and the rock shelf 8 inches down in the south field, and the way the water moved in March, and where the last of the winter cold collected in the north-facing corner of the storage addition. She knew where she was. "Yes," she said to Vera. "I think that's right." Silas asked her to marry him in July, not with ceremony, which was right, because ceremony would have been wrong for what they were. But in the middle of an ordinary conversation about the storage addition's roof, which had developed a minor issue with one of the shingles, and they were both looking at it, and he said, without particular drama, "I've been thinking that I'd like to ask you something." She looked at him. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "not to help you. Not because I think you need it, because I want to build the rest of my life alongside what you're building, and I'd like it to be a real thing, a legal and actual and decided thing, if you want that." She looked back at the shingle. "The shingle's lifting on the left side," she said. "I know. If we don't fix it before August, the heat will curl it, and then we'll need to replace it." "I know." A pause. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again, in case the first one hadn't landed clearly. "But I keep the land in my name. The deed stays as it is." "Obviously," he said, as though this were so clear it barely needed saying, which was one of the many reasons she'd said yes. "And I run the household accounts. I'd expect nothing else. And when I'm wrong about something, you tell me, not around me, not after the fact, directly." He looked at her steadily. "Same to you." "Same to me," she agreed. They fixed the shingle that afternoon. She was the one who went up on the roof because she knew the roof's weight tolerances better than he did, which he accepted without comment, and she reset the shingle with the particular care of someone who had learned that small problems fixed early were the only version of maintenance that made sense. And when she came down, he handed her the hammer she'd left at the base of the ladder, and she took it, and they went inside for supper. It was not romantic in the conventional sense. It was better than that. It was 2 people who had looked at each other clearly and said, "Yes, you," with full knowledge of what yes meant and what it required and what it would cost in the specific and unromanticized terms of an actual shared life. They were married in September, in Vera's back garden, which was the largest private outdoor space in town that didn't belong to a church, and had the additional advantage of belonging to Vera, who arranged everything with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had attended 2 of her own weddings and knew what mattered and what didn't. What mattered, the legal documents, witnessed correctly. The presence of people who were genuinely there because they wanted to be. Enough food. What didn't matter, decoration, performance, the elaborate apparatus of a ceremony designed to impress. Hattie was there, in her good dress, with her notebook. She was not taking notes during the ceremony, because Naomi had asked her not to, but she had the notebook in her coat pocket, and Naomi suspected some observations were being made mentally and would be transferred to paper later. She didn't mind. This was who Hattie was. You didn't ask Hattie to stop paying attention. You could only direct it. Calvin Rowan came. He stood at the edge of the garden in the way he stood everywhere, not performing his presence, simply occupying it. And when the simple exchange of vows was done, and Oakes, who had turned out to have the legal authority to perform the ceremony in addition to his other services, said it was finished, Calvin walked over to Naomi and said, "Welcome to the county, Mrs. Rowan, officially." She looked at him. "I've been here a year." "You've been building here a year," he said. "That's not the same as being here. Now you're here." She thought that was possibly the most words Calvin Rowan had said to her in one exchange since the day she'd asked him about his wife's drawings, and he told her about the 4 revisions to the drainage channel. She thought he probably knew that and had chosen this moment for it deliberately. "Thank you," she said, "for the letter, for the testimony, for—" She paused, because listing it all would take longer than was right for this moment. "For taking me seriously when you didn't have to." He looked at her in the way that meant he was being precise. "I took you seriously because you were serious," he said. "There's no charity in that." Silas appeared at her elbow and Calvin handed him a brief, firm handshake, and that was the full extent of the Rowan family's emotional expressiveness at the wedding, which was precisely correct. The first year of their marriage was not without friction, because nothing real is without friction. She was not easy to live alongside. She had been on her own long enough that her habits were set, and some of them were set in ways that required accommodation from anyone sharing her space. She kept the accounts. She made the decisions about the land and the cabin. She did not naturally defer in arguments, and Silas did not naturally back down. And there were 3 or 4 real disagreements in that first year that were genuinely difficult, not dangerous, nothing that touched the core of what they were, but real, not resolved easily, not resolved without someone being wrong and acknowledging it. She was wrong about the Northfield drainage approach in October of their first year together, and she said so directly, and it cost her something, and she paid it. He was wrong about the winter feed storage calculation in December, and said so the same way. They were not 2 people who couldn't be wrong. They were 2 people who could say it. That turned out to matter more than she'd understood when she made it a condition. Clara turned 1 in the cabin she'd been born in. She was walking by then, not steadily, with the committed staggering of someone who has recently discovered that upright is possible and is not going to let the difficulty of it be a reason to stop. She had words. Mama, and a version of Silas's name that came out as something between his name and a small animal sound, and the word no, which she had mastered completely and used with frequency and confidence. Naomi looked at her daughter using the word no with full commitment and felt something she recognized as the deepest kind of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, more fundamental. Clara was already herself, already certain that her own reaction to things was worth expressing. Know your own mind. Yes, exactly that. The potato harvest that fall exceeded her estimate by a third. She sold to Vera's boarding house and to the Tillman family, and to 2 other households and to the Rowan Ranch kitchen, which was the largest single sale and meant a winter with real financial margin for the first time. She noted the yield, the customer amounts, the prices, the date, and filed it in the system she'd developed over the year. Not just a list, but a record, something she could learn from, something Clara could look at someday and understand what the first years had cost and what they'd produced. Hattie's customer list from the planting day was in there too. She'd kept it. Hattie had been right about most of it. Iron Hollow in the second year of Naomi's time, there was not the same town it had been when she arrived. That would be overstating it. Towns don't change the way people do. Not quickly. But things had shifted. She could feel it in the way people spoke to her in the dry goods store, in the way the commissioner's wife, not Margaret, the other one, the quieter one, had asked her opinion about soil management at the general meeting in August, and actually listened to the answer. She was not beloved. She was not a figure of easy admiration. Some people in Iron Hollow would always find her too direct, too certain, too unwilling to soften her edges for their comfort, and she had made her peace with that specific limitation of her appeal. But she was known. She was known as the woman who had built the cabin, who had fought Harrow in the courtroom and won, who had turned the South Field and planted it and produced a real crop, and sold it at fair prices and kept her accounts correctly, and raised a daughter and married a Rowan, and not, through any of it, become anything other than exactly who she'd been when she stepped off that wagon. That was the thing. Finally, that Iron Hollow seemed to have settled on respecting the consistency of her. She had not changed to suit them, and she had not hardened against them. She had simply been what she was, steadily, long enough that even the people who'd expected her to fail or fold had run out of room to hold that expectation. Margaret Holloway came to see her in October of the second year. Not a social call exactly. Margaret was careful enough never to make anything exactly what it was. She came ostensibly to talk about a proposal before the county women's group about a lending library, which was a real thing, and Naomi had a real opinion about. But after they talked about the lending library for 20 minutes at Naomi's kitchen table, with Clara playing on the floor between them, Margaret said, "I want to say something." "All right," Naomi said. "I made your first months here more difficult than they needed to be." Naomi looked at her. "Yes. I'm not going to explain why. You know why." "Yes," Naomi said again. "I want to say that I was wrong about you, not about who you are. I think I always knew, roughly, who you were. I was wrong about whether someone like you was something this county needed." Margaret looked at her hands on the table. "We needed it. I didn't know that until I watched you." It was the most honest thing Naomi had ever heard from Margaret Holloway, and probably one of the most honest things Margaret had said out loud in a long time. Naomi sat with it without rushing to fill the space around it. "The lending library proposal," she said finally. "You'll have my support." Margaret looked up. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite relief, something quieter. "Thank you." And Margaret, she waited until the other woman was looking at her directly. "What you said in the parlor, that day I came to see you, about your marriage not being your choice." A pause. "I've thought about that." Margaret was very still. "I think you've been braver than anyone knows," Naomi said, "in the ways that were available to you." She meant it. She had thought about it for a long time, and she meant it precisely, not as a consolation, but as an accurate assessment. "That's not nothing." Margaret picked up her teacup, set it down without drinking from it. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." They talked for another hour after that, about the lending library, and about the county, and about several things that had nothing to do with either of them specifically. And when Margaret left, she said goodbye with the quality of a woman who had been somewhere real and knew it. Naomi stood in the doorway after she left and looked at the ridge falling away toward town, and at the south field where the second season's planting was already planned on paper on the table behind her, and at the storage addition which had become a real addition over the past year, properly finished, shelved, sealed, and at Clara pulling herself up on the doorframe beside her. Clara looked up at her with those gray, skeptical eyes that had been skeptical since the day she arrived in the world, and said with great seriousness, "No." "Not right now," Naomi agreed. She picked her daughter up and held her against her shoulder and looked at the cabin she'd built. Really looked at it, the way she didn't always let herself look at it because there was always something to fix or improve or add to the list. The eastern seam that she'd sealed twice and now was simply part of the wall. The loft above the main room. The storage addition running north. The bench along the south wall where Vera sat on warm evenings. The window with the quarter-inch crookedness that she still noticed every time and had decided, finally, to leave. Not because she couldn't fix it, but because it was part of the record. It was there when she built it. It was hers. Silas came around the corner of the storage addition, having been checking the north wall for winter preparation the way he did every October, and stopped when he saw her standing in the doorway. He looked at her and at Clara and at whatever expression was on her face. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking at it." He looked at the cabin, too. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, in the October light. "The north wall's good," he said. "No issues." "I know," she said. "I checked it last week." "I know you did. I checked it again." She looked at him. "Belt and suspenders," he said. "Belt and suspenders," she agreed. That was marriage, she had learned. Not the grand gesture and not the romance of difficulty overcome, but this. Two people who both check the north wall in October because winter is coming and the wall needs to be right, and neither of them finds that redundant. Two people who have looked at each other's limitations and said yes anyway, and mean it in the practical daily sense that yes has to be meant and to be worth anything. She had built this. Not alone. She had stopped pretending that alone meant what she'd once thought it meant. Alone was never absolute. You couldn't build anything worth building without someone handing you a water bucket at the right moment, without someone checking the lumber for the bough you'd missed, without someone sitting across from you in an office and saying your evidence is good when you needed to hear it from someone with legal standing to assess it. The trick was in the difference between help that diminishes you and help that doesn't. The trick was in knowing what you were actually building, which was never only the structure. It was the terms, the conditions under which you would exist in the world, the right to make decisions about your own life without submitting them to someone else's approval. She had built those terms, board by board, season by season, argument by argument. She had stood in a courtroom and said Clara is not a thing and meant it in every direction, including toward herself. She was not a thing. She was a person with a deed and a list and a Southfield and a daughter and a husband who checked the north wall in October and a 10-year-old who kept a customer list and an old man who put his late wife's drawings in a drawer she was allowed to open. None of it had come clean. None of it had arrived the way she'd planned it. The cabin had a crooked window. The Southfield still had one spot where the drainage wasn't perfect. Her marriage had friction. Her daughter said no to everything with a force that was occasionally exhausting. The town of Iron Hollow still had people in it who found her too much, and she still sometimes pushed past pain she should rest for, and she still sometimes lay awake at night running lists when she should be sleeping. She was not finished. You were never finished. That had been the lesson of the cabin from the beginning. You sealed the eastern seam, and then the roof needed the shingle, and then the loft needed the floor, and then the storage needed the shelf. And the work didn't end, but it changed, and what it changed into was not burden, but simply life. The ongoing, imperfect, costly, real project of being alive in a specific place among specific people in specific circumstances that you had, against considerable odds, had some say in choosing. She had had her say. Clara grabbed a fistful of her collar with the grip of someone who has recently discovered hands and their possibilities, and pulled, and Naomi shifted her daughter to her other hip and stepped back inside the cabin she had built and let the door close behind her against the October wind. The list was on the table. There were 8 things on it. She would get to all of them, in order, in their time. She sat down and picked up her pencil. Outside, Silas went back to checking the north wall, and the ridge held the afternoon light the way it always did in October, gold and low and going quickly, and Iron Hollow below was doing what it had always done, talking, deciding, revising. And somewhere in the town, a 10-year-old girl was filling a notebook with observations about the world and taking it seriously, which was the most important thing Naomi had given her, and also the thing Naomi had given herself before she gave it to anyone else. She added a 9th item to the list. Then she got to work.